The villagers all belonged to the Goya caste, which is the caste of cultivators. If you had asked them what their occupation was, they would have replied, the cultivation of rice. But in reality, they only cultivated rice about once in 10 years. Rice requires water in plenty. It must stand in water for weeks before it grows ripe for the reaping. It could only be cultivated if the village tank filled with water, and much rain had to fall before the tank filled. If the rains from the northeast in November were good, and the people could borrow seed, then the rice fields in January and February were green, and the year brought the village health and strength, for rice gives strength as does no other food. But this happened very rarely. Usually the village lived entirely by cultivating chenas. In August, every man took a kati and went out into the jungle and cut down the undergrowth, over an acre or two. Then he returned home. In September, he went out again and set fire to the dead undergrowth, and at night the jungle would be lit up by points of fire scattered round the village for miles. For so sterile is the earth that a chena burnt and sown for 1 year will yield no crop again for 10 years. Thus the villagers must each year find fresh jungle to burn. In October, the land is cleared of ash and rubbish, and when the rains fall in November, the ground is sown broadcast with millet or kurakan or maize, with pumpkins, chilies, and a few vegetables. In February, the grain is reaped, and on it the village must live until the next February. No man will ever do any other work, nor will he leave the village in search of work. But even in a good year, the grain from the chenas was scarcely sufficient for the villagers. And just as in the jungle, fear and hunger forever crouch, slink, and peer with every beast, so hunger and the fear of hunger always lay upon the village. It was only for a few months each year after the crop was reaped that the villagers knew the daily comfort of a full belly. And the grain grown in chenas is an evil food, heating the blood and bringing fever and the foulness of all diseases, parangi. There were few in the village without the filthy sores of parangi, their legs eaten out in the bone with the yellow, sweating ulcers, upon which the flies settled in swarms. The naked children, soon after their birth, crawled about with immense pale yellow bellies swollen with fever, their faces puffed with dropsy, their arms and legs thin, twisted little sticks. The spirit of the jungle is in the village and in the people who live in it. They are simple, silent, sullen men. In their faces you can see plainly the fear and hardship of their lives. They are very near to the animals which live in the jungle around them. They look at you with the melancholy and patient stupidity of the buffalo in their eyes, or the cunning of the jackal. And there is in them the blind anger of the jungle, the ferocity of the leopard, and the sudden fury of the beast. In Bedagama, there lived a man called Silindu with his wife Dingihami. They formed one of the 10 families which made up the village, and all the families were connected more or less closely by marriage. Silindu was a cousin of the wife of Babahami, the headman, who lived in the adjoining compound. Babahami had been made a headman because he was the only man in the village who could write his name. He was a very small man and was known as Punchi Arachi, the little Arachi. Years ago, when a young man, he had gone on a pilgrimage to the Vihari at Medahamahanawara. He had fallen ill there and had stayed for a month or two in the priest's pansala. The priest had taught him his letters, and he had learnt enough to be able to write his own name. Silindu was a cultivator like the other villagers, The village called him Tikak Pisu, slightly mad. Even in working in the China, he was the laziest man in the village. His real occupation was hunting. That is to say, he shot deer and pig with a long muzzle-loading gas pipe gun whenever he could creep up to one in the thick jungle, or, lying by the side of a waterhole at night, shoot down some beast who had come there to drink. Why this silent little man, with the pinched-up face of a grey monkey and the long, silent, sliding step, should be thought slightly mad, was not immediately apparent. He seemed only at first a little more taciturn and inert than the other villagers, but the village had its reasons. Silindu slept with his eyes open like some animals, and very often he would moan, whine, and twitch in his sleep like a dog. He slept as lightly as a deer, and would start up from the heaviest sleep in an instant, fully awake. When not in the jungle, he squatted all day long in the shadow of his hut, staring before him, and no one could tell whether he was asleep or awake. Often you would have to shout at him and touch him before he would attend to what you had to say. But the strangest thing about him was this, that although he knew the jungle better than any man in the whole district, and although he was always wandering through it, his fear of it was great. He never attempted to explain or to deny this fear. When other hunters laughed at him about it, all he would say was, "I am not afraid of any animal in the jungle. No, not even of the bear or of the solitary elephant, whom all of you really fear. But I am afraid of the jungle." But though he feared it, he loved it in a strange, unconscious way, in the same unconscious way in which the wild buffalo loves the wallow and the leopard his lair among the rocks. Silent, inert, and sullen, he worked in the chaina or squatted about his compound. But when he started for the jungle, he became a different man. With slightly bent knees and toes turned out, he glided through the impenetrable scrub with a long, slinking stride, which seemed to show at once both the fear and the joy in his heart. And Silindu's passions, his anger and his desire, were straight and strange and violent, even for the jungle. It was not easy to rouse his anger. He was a quiet man who did not really recognize the hand which wronged him. But if he were roused, he would sit for hours or days motionless in his compound, his mind moving vaguely with hatred. And then suddenly he would rise and search out his enemy and fall upon him like a wild beast. And sometimes at night a long-drawn howl would come from Silindu's hut, and the villagers would laugh and say, "Hark, the leopard is with his mate." And the woman next morning, when they saw Dingihami drawing water from the tank, would jeer at her. At length, Dingihami bore twins, 2 girls, of whom one was called Pudchimenika and the other Hinihami. When the women told Silindu that his wife was delivered of 2 girls, he rushed into the hut and began to beat his wife on the head and breasts as she lay on the mat, crying, "Vesi, Vesi Mao, where is the son who is to carry my gun into the jungle, and who will clear the chaina for me? Do you hear me, Vesi? For me to feed and clothe and provide dowries? Do you bear me, Vesi, for me to feed and clothe and provide dowries? Curse you!" And this was the beginning of Silindu's quarrel with Babahami, the headman. For Babahami, hearing the cries of Dingihami and the other women, rushed up from the adjoining compound and dragged Silindu from the house. Dingihami died 2 days after giving birth to the twins. Silindu had a sister called Kalinahami, who lived in a house at the other end of the village. Misfortune had fallen upon her, and misfortune so common in the life of a jungle village. Her husband had died of fever 2 months before. A month later, she bore a child which lived but 2 weeks. When Dingihami died, Silindu brought her to his hut to bring up his 2 children. Her hut was abandoned to the jungle. When the next rains fell, the mud walls crumbled away, the tattered roof fell in, the jungle crept forward into the compound and over the ruined walls. And when Punchi Menaka was 2 years old, only a little mound in that jungle marked the place where Kalinahami's house had stood. Kalinahami was a short, dark, stumpy woman with large, impassive eyes set far apart from one another, flat, broad cheeks, big breasts, and thick legs. Unlike her brother, she was always busy sweeping the house and compound, fetching water from the tank, cooking, and attending to the children. Very soon after she came to Silindu's house, she began to talk and think of the children as though she had borne them herself. Like her brother, she was slow and sparing of speech, and her eyes often had in them the look, so often in his, as if she were watching something far away in the distance. She very rarely took much part in the interminable gossip of the other village women when they met at the tank or outside their huts. This gossip is always connected with their husbands and children, food, and quarrels. But Kalinahami was noted for her storytelling. She was never very willing to begin, but often after the evening meal had been eaten, the women and many of the men would gather in Silindu's compound to listen to one of her stories. They sat around the one room or outside around the door, very still and silent, listening to her droning voice as she squatted by the fire and stared out into the darkness. Outside lay Silindu, apparently paying no attention to the tale. The stories were either old tales, which she had learnt from her mother, or were stories usually about Buddha, which she had heard told by pilgrims round their campfire on their way to pilgrimages, or in the madamas or pilgrims' resting houses at festivals. These tales, and a curious droning chant with which she used to sing them to sleep, were the first things that the two children remembered. This chant was peculiar to Kalinahami, and no other woman of the village used it. She had learnt it from her mother. The words ran thus: "Sleep, child, sleep against my side. Ayo, ayo, the weary way you've cried. Hush, child, hush, press close against my side. Ayo, ayo, will the trees never end? Our women's feet are weary. O great one, send night on us, that our wanderings may end. Hush, child, hush, thy father leads the way. Thy mother's feet are weary, but the day will end somewhere for the followers in the way. Ayo, ayo, the way is rough and steep. Ayo, the thorns and sharp, the rivers deep. But the night comes at last, so sleep, child, sleep." Until Punchi Menaka and Hanehama were 3 years old, Silindu appeared not even to be aware of their existence. He took no notice of them in the house or compound, and never spoke about them. But one day he was sitting in front of his hut, staring into the jungle, when Punchi Menaka crawled up to him and put her hand on his knee, and looked solemnly up into his face. Silindu looked down at her, took her by her hands, and stood her up between his 2 knees. He stared vacantly into her eyes for some time, and then suddenly he began to speak to her in a low voice. "Little toad, why have you left the pond? Isn't there food there for your little belly? Rice and coconuts and mangoes and little cakes of kurakan? Is the belly full that you have left the pond for the jungle? Foolish little toad. The water is good, but the trees are evil. You have come to a bad place of dangers and devils. Yesterday, little toad, I lay under a domba tree by the side of a track, my gun in my hand, waiting for what might pass. The devils are very angry in the jungle, for there has been no rain now for these 3 months. The waterholes are dry, the leaves and grass are brown, the deer are very thin, and the fawns dropped this year are dying of weakness and hunger and thirst. Therefore the devils are hungry, and there is nothing more terrible than a hungry devil. Well, there I lay, flat on the ground, with my gun in my hand, and I saw on the opposite side of the track, lying under a domba tree, a leopardess waiting for what might pass. I put down my gun and said, "Sister," I said, "is the belly empty?" For her coat was mangy, and the belly caught up below as though with a pain. "Yakko, he-devil," she answered. 3 days now I have killed but one thin grey monkey, and there are 2 cubs in the cave to be fed. "Yakini, she-devil," I said, "there are 2 little toads at home to be fed, but I still have a handful of kurakan in my hut, from which my sister can make cakes. It remains from last year's chena, and after it is eaten there will be nothing. The head man, too, is pressing for the 3 shillings body tax. How, I say to him, can there be money where there is not even food? But the kurakan will last until next Poya Day. Therefore your hunger is greater than mine. The first kill is yours." So we lay there still a long time, and at last I heard far away the sound of a hoof upon a dry stick. "Sister," I whispered, "I hear a deer coming this way." "Yakko, have you no ears?" she said. "A long while now. I have been listening to a herd of wild pig coming downwind. Can you not even now hear their strong breathing and their rooting in the dry earth, and the patter of the young one's feet on the dry leaves?" "Yakini," I said, for I heard her teeth clicking in the darkness, "the ear of the hungry is in the belly. The sound of your teeth can be heard a hoo cry distance away." So we lay still again, and at last the herd of pigs came down the track. First came an old boar, very black, his tusks shining white in the shadows, then many sows and young boars, and here and there the little pigs running in and out among the sows. And as they passed, one of the little pigs ran out near the domba bush, and Yakini sprung and caught it in her teeth and leapt with it into the branch of a palu tree which overhung the path. There she sat, and the little pig in her mouth screamed to its mother. Then all the little pigs ran together screaming and stood on one side near the bush where I lay, and the great boars and the young boars and sows ran round the palu tree, looking up at Yakini and making a great noise. And the old sow, who had borne the little pig in Yakini's mouth, put her forefoot against the trunk of the tree and looked up and said, "Come down, Yakini, she-devil, thief! Are you afraid of an old tuskless sow? Come down!" But the leopardess laughed and bit the little pig in the back behind the head until it died, and she called down to the old sow, "Go your way, mother. There are 2 cubs at home in the cave, and they are very hungry. Every year I drop but 1 or 2 cubs in the cave, but the whole jungle swarms with your spawn. I see 8 brothers and sisters of your child there by the domba bush. Go your way, lest I choose another for my mate. Also, I do not like your man's teeth." The old boar and the sows were very angry, and for a long while they ran round the tree and tore at it with their tusks and looked up and cursed Yakini. But Yakini sat and watched them and licked the blood which dropped from the little pig's back. I too lay very still under my domba bush, for there is danger in an angry herd. At last the old boar became tired, and he gathered the little pigs together in the middle of the herd and led them away down the track. Then Yakini dropped to the ground and bounded away into the jungle, carrying the little pig in her mouth. So you see, little crow, it is a bad place to which you have come. Be careful. or some other devil will drop on you out of a bush and carry you off in his mouth. While Silindu had been speaking, Hinihami had crawled and tottered across the compound to join her sister. At the end of his long story, she was leaning against his shoulder. From that day, he seemed to regard the two children differently from the rest of the world in which he lived. He was never tired of pouring out to them in a low, monotonous drone his thoughts, opinions, and doings. Though that they did not understand a word of what he said did not trouble him in the least. But when they grew old enough to understand and to speak and to question him, he began to take a new pleasure in explaining to them the world in which he lived. It was a strange world, a world of bare and brutal facts, of superstition, of grotesque imagination, a world of trees and the perpetual twilight of their shade, a world of hunger and fear and devils, where a man was helpless before the unseen and unintelligible powers surrounding him. He would go over to them again and again in the season of drought, the reckoning of his small store of grain, and the near approach of time when it would be exhausted. His perpetual fear of hunger, his means and plans for obtaining just enough for existence until the next Chena season. But above all, his pleasure seemed to be to tell them of the jungle, of his wanderings in search of game, of his watchings by the waterholes at night, of the animals and devils which lived among its shadows.